What is the purpose surrounding maintenance or spousal support?
Right. So it's typically to,
How much does earning capacity matter when a judge is considering fixed term maintenance versus indefinite maintenance?
right. So factors or something to consider with this is,
Hi, everyone. It's Katie VanDeusen from Sterling Hughes, and I am here on our podcast, the Illinois Family Law Insider, and I have Senior Associate Jacqueline McClellan joining me today. Thanks for joining me, Jacqueline.
thanks, Katie. I'm happy to be here.
So, today we're going to be talking about what types of Illinois spousal support or maintenance exist, and kind of delving into the different types of maintenance and some details or nuances with regard to those things. So, let's first start, Jacqueline, with a really common question. If someone hears that they might get spousal support, what does that actually mean under Illinois law?
So that typically means that one spouse is earning significantly more than the other spouse. And then the spouse earning significantly more would essentially pay maintenance to that other spouse.
And the term alimony is always thrown out there, but really, Illinois no longer uses alimony as a term. It really exclusively uses maintenance or spousal support. But can you talk us through what different types of maintenance or spousal support exists in Illinois?
Yeah, absolutely. So there's a couple different types. So there's fixed term maintenance, there's indefinite maintenance, and then there's reviewable maintenance. And then depending on the circumstances, if it's a maintenance case, then those would apply.
Okay. And then prior to kind of delving into the details of the different types of maintenance, what is the basic purpose behind maintenance in Illinois? I know you kind of alluded to the difference in, earnings, but what is the purpose surrounding maintenance or spousal support?
Right. So it's typically to assist the lower earning spouse to kind of maintain that similar lifestyle that they would have enjoyed had they stayed married.
Okay. And is maintenance or spousal support automatic in every case? Or what is your kind of rule of thumb when it comes to whether or not maintenance is at play in any given case?
So it is definitely not automatic. The court does have to determine whether or not it is a maintenance case. So that's the first test: is this actually a maintenance case? Does this other party really need that maintenance to maintain that similar standard of living? That's the first thing that they look at, is whether or not it actually is a maintenance case. So it's not just because the other spouse earns significantly more. It's they earn significantly more, and that other spouse will not have the ability to earn, similar to that other the spouse that would be paying maintenance.
Okay. And I don't know about in your experience, but I feel like it's probably the same where the judges also have this list of factors that they kind of apply, and that really helps them decide whether or not it is a maintenance case. And then if they're deciding that, then the second kind of step is what type and for how long and for in what amount, right? And that's kind of where the formula I think comes into play. But
Exactly.
in your experience, like, is this really formula based, or is there some discretion at play where the judge can say, you know what, I understand what the formula is showing me, but I think this is what's more appropriate in this case?
Oh, absolutely. So it is at the judge's discretion whether or not they want to give maintenance or not. They can deviate up or down depending on the circumstances. For example, if one party has serious health issues, that may be a really good basis for why they should actually get an increase in support than what's statutorily pursuant to the formula.
Okay, that's great to know. Absolutely. So it really sounds to me like it's based on the facts of each individual case. If the judge is going to deviate, I know that they have to make those specific
Right.
findings, right? And so I think as attorneys, we always want to be focusing in on what are the facts of the case and how do those facts help us support findings for whether or not the court should deviate upwards or downwards? And I will say also, I know that the formula is not automatic. It's not something that's automatically applied. I do think, though, and, tell me your experience on this. I feel like judges kind of start there as almost like a default and then deviate based on facts of the case or arguments that are made if they find them compelling. And it's just, I would say it's really based on whatever the judge finds appropriate. And it's just so fact based, it's hard to predict what will or won't happen in any given case.
Yeah, yeah, I mean, you made a really good point. It's case by case, but it's also judge by judge. It
Yeah,
completely depends what that judge's perception of what they believe the maintenance statute is meant for. So,
absolutely agree.
depends.
Yep. And then what is temporary maintenance? We just listed off these three types of
Right.
maintenance. You said fixed term, we have indefinite and reviewable, but what is temporary maintenance and how does that come into play in cases?
So, temporary maintenance would be maybe maintenance that's payable while the case is ongoing. So, one party would have to request or file a motion for that maintenance, or you reach an agreement to set maintenance for a temporary duration, or actually, the temporary duration is while the case is ongoing, essentially. So, you have to file a motion, and then whether or not it's granted or you have an agreement.
And in terms of, strategy, when it comes to your practice, Jacqueline, and let's say temporary maintenance is coming into play, when you represent the person who's receiving maintenance, does your strategy change at all in comparison to when you're representing someone who is paying temporary maintenance?
Yes. So
And
it depends.
wow,
If am representing the client that would be receiving maintenance, the question I would ask is, well, is this other spouse paying all of your expenses right now? What actually would support be if we were to file? So we take
yep,
into both incomes into account. That's important because if they're paying more in expenses than what you would receive, it probably makes sense for them to continue to pay those expenses, most likely.
yep.
If I'm representing the client who would be paying, I think what would it would depend on is would the could we get the person that was receiving the sport to then contribute to the expenses? Do that cost benefit analysis for in that regard as well.
Definitely. The only other thing I would also add too is sometimes if you're representing the person who's paying the temporary support, it might be beneficial too because if it is a maintenance case or spousal support case, they may end up receiving some type of credit on their overall duration or the overall, duration of the award. Granted, that's in the judge's discretion, but sometimes that's a strategy play. If you want to try to get that credit, you really need to kind of establish that temporary support award sooner rather than later. And that could be knocking off months, that the person's paying overall. So
Right.
that's always something. It's really I feel like imperative that the attorney talks to the client about those types of routes and what strategy is best, and then let them make the most informed decision in that circumstance.
Right. Agreed. Totally.
And you referenced this before, payment of expenses. How does the status quo come into play when you think about that cost benefit for the person and talking to them about that?
Right. So, like I said before, you want to take into account how much do these expenses for this household actually cost? Um,
Right.
who is paying them? Is this person that would be potentially receiving support contributing anything at all? Are they working? Because if they're not, then you'd probably assume that the person that would be paying support is also paying all those expenses. So
Yep.
you'd want to factor in what would support be, what are the expenses, how much are you actually going to potentially need to contribute to those expenses once you do receive support, because it may not make sense to start that duration that you referred to at this point while all of your expenses are paid.
Exactly, and that status quo also plays into, like, standard of living during the course of the marriage, and if one person wasn't working and maybe is taking care of the children, whether or not it makes sense to, maintain that status quo and maybe lean into, that person continuing to pay all of those expenses as part of that status quo versus establishing a temporary support amount and then the other person having to contribute to the household. It
Right.
really is an in-depth, analysis that has to occur, and it's case by case basis, right?
Totally agreed.
Yeah. Okay, so going into kind of, pivoting a little bit and going into the different types of maintenance, let's talk about fixed term maintenance first. What does that mean? What is fixed term maintenance?
Yeah, so fixed term maintenance, typically it's based on the date you were married until the date someone files for divorce. Based
Okay.
on that, there's a formula to determine how many months you'd be statutorily required in the event it is a maintenance case to actually pay that maintenance.
Okay. And so when it comes to that fixed term amount, when you come up with that duration, typically does it terminate after that duration is over?
Yes, yes, it would terminate at the end of that term.
Okay. And then whenever it comes to fixed term maintenance, how does a modification come into play? Can you ever modify the amount or even the duration? And what does that look like or how does that work?
Yes, if it's fixed term, it's going to be modifiable. So it's modifiable upon a substantial change in circumstances, unless you agreed for it to be non-modifiable, which I typically don't advise clients to do. But yes, if let's say that other spouse that would be receiving the support starts earning $150,000, which is way above what it was previously, you can file a motion to modify that maintenance based on that.
Got it. And when it comes to your practice, have you ever had a client who was receiving fixed term maintenance and maybe utilize that time to go back to school or to seek out maybe retraining? And were they able to start working again?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that's exactly what maintenance is supposed to be used for. You're supposed to use that time to rehabilitate yourself, get back into the workforce, and start to, be earning maybe somewhat close to what the opposing or the spouse was earning, or at least somewhere where you're comfortable with your circumstances.
Got it. And then let's talk about reviewable maintenance. So, when it comes to reviewable maintenance, how does that change or differ from fixed term maintenance?
Right. So reviewable maintenance would typically mean or does mean that you have a select date where either party can come back and file a motion for maintenance to be reviewed. The judge looks at all the circumstances, the facts, determines whether maintenance should be modified, whether it should be terminated, or whether it should be extended.
Okay.
So, that's essentially what reviewable maintenance would be.
And I think one of the biggest differences too that I've experienced in practice is when it comes to reviewable maintenance, it's almost like that is somewhat automatic. Like the judge already understands that this is going to be reviewed versus when someone comes in to try to modify or seek to change the amount, that burden is on the party filing to really say why should this be
Right.
changed, modified from what was originally set forth as part of the terms of the agreement. And then in terms of what happens at the review, do you feel like does the receiving spouse still have to show that they need the support, and how would you go about doing that at that time?
Yeah, I mean, that's why it's reviewable. I mean, it's for one side to say they don't need it anymore, and for the spouse receiving it to, or ex-spouse receiving it to show that they still need it and why. So, in terms of that, maybe since then there's been some health issues that have come up, and that shows why you're unable to continue your career or excel in your career because you're dealing with some health issues or whatever the circumstances may be. If you hire an attorney to assist you with that, it's their job to show the court why the support is still needed for the ex-spouse receiving the support.
Absolutely. And have you ever seen a judge choose this type of reviewable maintenance over maybe fixed term or indefinite?
I actually have not had a judge give reviewable maintenance before. I've tried, but I've not gotten that before. Have you, Katie?
I feel like the timeframes where I've utilized this is in negotiation,
Mm,
right? Where
yeah,
you get, both sides are in agreement to the review. I
right,
would say it is less frequent that I see reviewable maintenance versus fixed term or indefinite. I totally agree that it's less common. I would say in the circumstances where I've seen it, maybe it's a shorter term marriage or a shorter duration, and the judge is really wanting the other party to rehabilitate themselves. So they give a shorter review period to come back and see what efforts have has that spouse made or that ex-spouse made to
right,
kind of rehabilitate themselves, get to an earning capacity that is increased over time, versus fixed term or indefinite. That's been my experience, but I do agree with you. I think it's much less common, that type versus the other types.
right, right.
And then kind of segueing and going to the last type, indefinite maintenance. I feel like people hear this term, and if you're ordered to pay indefinite maintenance, you're probably spiraling in your head and thinking you're going to be paying this until you die or something
Right.
like that. And if you're receiving indefinite maintenance, you could also have the wrong impression to think, I'm just going to receiving this benefit until the day I die. What's the reality? What is the reality of indefinite maintenance, Jacqueline?
Right. So, I mean, indefinite maintenance, like I said before, maintenance is always modifiable. As long as it does not say non modifiable, maintenance is always modifiable. So, for example, if you were earning a significant amount, but you're at a reasonable retirement age and you go to retire, well, now you're earning significantly less. So, that could be a basis for a modification. There's also reasons like maybe that ex-spouse got remarried. The person receiving support got remarried. Well, you can absolutely file a motion to terminate based on that. If either ex-spouse dies, then obviously maintenance is going to be terminated. So indefinite does not mean forever. It can always be modifiable based on the circumstances.
And then what is your experience with retirement, right? And what's reasonable in terms of a retirement age?
Yeah.
Is there any type of rule or rule of thumb when it comes to this? Or is it really just a luck of the draw based on which judge you get assigned to?
It's a little bit of both. Uh,
Right.
so it depends. So what I like to ask clients is, why don't you ask in your field of work or look around in your office, like around what age are people retiring? So I like to ask that question because if, let's say it's maybe a blue collar job and it's really physically labor intensive, it may make sense for them to retire at an earlier age. Whereas maybe someone like an attorney or an accountant who's just using their mind, maybe it makes more sense for them to retire at age 65, 67. It just completely depends. And it does depend on the judge as well and what they believe is a reasonable retirement age.
I totally agree with you. That's been my experience as well. It's spot on. And then in terms of factors, I know we reference the factors in the statute
Yeah.
uh, generally, but does age or health of the parties come into play when a judge is determining a maintenance award?
Yeah, it absolutely can. So if the divorce is occurring and both parties are 67 years old, they're probably not going to require those part and one spouse is, let's say, not working or has never worked. They're not going to require most likely that spouse to go back into the workforce when they're already at a reasonable retirement age. Or if one spouse is ailing health, that's another reason where it's probably not reasonable for a judge to force this spouse to go back into the workforce. So that absolutely comes into play.
And then when it comes to earning capacity, I know we've talked about this kind of phrase throughout the podcast, but how much does earning capacity matter when a judge is considering fixed term maintenance versus indefinite maintenance?
Right. So factors or something to consider with this is, how much is the spouse maybe earned during the marriage? That's important because if they, let's say they have two master's degrees and they were earning 150,000 and then they stopped working, maybe to take care of children.
Mhm.
Um, they at least have the ability to earn a significant amount. So that is going to come into play as well when looking whether it's going to be a term or indefinite maintenance.
Definitely. And how do you feel like lifestyle plays a role in how a judge decides this particular issue, maintenance in general?
Right. Yeah. So again, that's going to be a judge by judge, case by case basis. But if you're living a lavish lifestyle, and you always have throughout the marriage, then the court may take that into consideration as well. Like, what really are you? What is your earning capacity? What could it potentially be? And if it's significantly lower still than the spouse that would be paying maintenance, and that's probably they would take that into consideration for sure.
And then when it comes to kind of strategy in these cases, I know we talked about, reviewable and settlement negotiations. Can parties agree to waive maintenance or negotiate something that is maybe outside of this kind of statutory formula? And if they do that, what do you have on your radar as the attorney when considering how to present that to a judge?
Right. Yeah. So, yes, you can waive maintenance, but it's our job as attorneys to advise you that if you waive maintenance, it's gone forever. So you can't come back and seek maintenance after waiving it. But in terms of negotiating, like maybe it's a longer duration but a shorter amount, or a smaller amount but a longer duration, like we can absolutely use these negotiation tools to try to reach an agreement. I mean, I have clients do it all the time. So when you go to explain to the judge, well, the basis of that is maybe this spouse receiving maintenance needs a little bit more time to actually rehabilitate themselves, to get them back to the earning capacity that they could potentially acquire or had previously. um,
Yep.
that's kind of where my head would go if I'm trying to convince or advise the judge why we reached the agreement that we did.
Yep. I always find in practice, the more context you can give to the judge about why the parties are making, why they've reached the terms of the agreement that they did, and providing that color and that context to the judge, I think just increases the likelihood that they're more willing to agree that such terms are fair and equitable, right? So, any type of an agreement that we come to or we negotiate, it always has to be fair and equitable. And giving that additional context to the judge can really make or break whether or not they find it to be fair and equitable or not. Would you agree?
Totally
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah, and I think, being strategic about how you present the reasoning behind that and why the parties are maybe choosing to do something in a specific way or for what purpose, or maybe each side is represented by an attorney and you're doing offsets, or there are certain things that are shifting in order to, you know, be the basis for why the parties have reached this set agreement. Again, giving that context to the judge, I've always felt has always made it stronger, or a stronger likelihood that the judge will approve something like that, versus looking at it and saying, you know what, this is not fair. This is not equitable. I'm not agreeing to this, or I'm not approving this.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
And then when it comes to, what someone should consider prior to waiving maintenance, especially if there's a large income gap, what would you advise the person? Would you go through and maybe run those support calculations for them and show them, like, this is what you're walking away from potentially, and giving them that context?
Yes, absolutely. And if I believe that they would be a maintenance candidate, but they say absolutely not, I don't want maintenance, I'd find some other way to hopefully get them a more beneficial outcome, like maybe a disproportionate share in favor of this person, or maybe like a buyout of maintenance where, we're not taking into consideration these factors of will terminate, where we coming back to review this maintenance, that kind of thing. So there are other alternatives or options that we can use to negotiate when one party insists on waiving maintenance, which honestly happens relatively frequently. People don't want to be connected to that spouse anymore, and I get that.
Right. And it's so nice to have these different tools to use in terms of settlement negotiations and strategy to help support the person and what they feel is best, right?
Right.
Talking to the client about all of those different options on the front end and letting them choose maybe what route makes the most sense for them and seeing if the other side is open and willing to talk about that as a resolution.
Yeah,
So great
absolutely.
points. Great points, Jacqueline. All right. So just to wrap up and kind of close, this podcast has been so helpful in terms of talking through the different types of maintenance, some of the strategy and details surrounding maintenance and what to expect. But if someone's concerned about financial stability following a divorce, Jacqueline, what's the first thing they should really ask their attorney about maintenance?
Yeah. So, I mean, the first thing I would ask is, am I entitled to maintenance based on, these incomes for both of the spouses? The next thing I would ask is, how long would this maintenance would be, and approximately how much you think you'd anticipate maintenance would be. And
Mhm.
obviously, your attorney's not going to be able to give you a definite answer right off the bat, but they could at least give you some sort of idea if you at least know those initial incomes for both parties and when you were married.
Absolutely. Those are great takeaways. And the other thing is, what would you say is the biggest misconception that clients have about spousal support or maintenance in Illinois?
Just because one spouse earns more than the other does not necessarily mean that a judge would award maintenance. It's
Yeah,
not,
not
it's not an
automatic.
absolute. Yeah.
Right, right, exactly. I totally agree. It's either what you just described, or also maybe that indefinite maintenance thing where
Right.
people just make these assumptions and they really need to talk to an attorney about
Right.
what indefinite maintenance is and what that means. So, thank you so much for joining me today, Jacqueline, and sitting with me and all of our listeners and really walking through maintenance in Illinois, the different types. Your points when it comes to strategy were just amazing. So thanks for joining us today.
Well, thank you, Katie.
Fighting over maintenance during a divorce is brutal, but what if the real mistake happened before you ever filed? One document could have changed everything, and most couples never consider it. Don't make the same mistake. Here is what to do instead.